Good morning.
Good morning.
Glad to see everyone this morning. I might as well just face this way. There's nobody over here. I don't really have any announcements, but it is a new day, new dawn. We'll see what the day holds. There's really no bad news as far as I know. The only thing I didn't get inquiry of, how is Kathy doing?
Better. She's still got a bad cough, a lot of congestion, but she's good. She's probably gonna go back to work tomorrow.
Okay,
She's out.
good. And Paul is out as well?
Yes.
Okay. And how is David doing? Okay. Well, that makes me more encouraged than I'm kidding. It's not. It's not. It drives me insane. Oh my. Well, that's kind of counterproductive with a manager, isn't it? Oh my. Well, that's good news for both of them. Does anybody have anyone that we do need to add to our prayer list? Because it kind of expanding and then gets smaller and expands. No. Okay, we will ask Jacob, if you will, lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll start with our lesson for this morning. Thank you. Okay, so we're starting on page 92 in the workbook, and we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 9 today. 2 Samuel chapter 9. Now, if you know a lot about the history of David and his connection with Jonathan, we're going to see that continuation of the promise that they made back in 1 Samuel, where they said, I'll take care of your family, you take care of mine, we'll be connected throughout life, even if we don't get to live with each other throughout life in terms of their friendship. After Jonathan died in the last chapter of 1 Samuel, there were a couple things that happened. Because Saul's reign ended, David was ruler. We've read that a couple chapters back. He was in Hebron. Then the elders of Israel came to David and said, we need a king, and we want you. So he moves the kingdom back to Jerusalem, and David starts to check his surroundings. Who's available to serve? Who's left of the former kingdom? And this chapter deals with that idea. Is there anyone left of the family of Saul? If there is, I want to see them. Now that might seem scary, and with the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, we're going to see he has that same kind of response. The king wants to see me. That's a little scary. But there's a powerful lesson involved with this when you look at the bigger eternal picture. But we'll talk about that concept more at the end. But this lesson will be pretty straightforward, especially from the commentary. He makes some pretty straightforward comments. But the introduction is going to get us up to par as to what's going on in the story of David, and then it's going to accelerate into our text. Now, one side point, we're on lesson 11. There are 2 more lessons, and then we're going to be jumping to the next lesson book. It's going to be lessons from Isaiah. We're currently doing Revelation on Wednesday nights. Isaiah, I kind of want to do the same thing that we're doing for Revelation, but there's going to be new workbooks. We need workbooks. I just realized that. But I'll have a worksheet that goes along with each of those lessons because the workbook doesn't lay it out the way that I like, but who cares what I like? But it lays it out to where you can understand the book better. So I'm going to give you some supplemental information to go along with Isaiah, but I would encourage you, go ahead and start reading that book. It's called the Bible in one book because it has 66 chapters. So go ahead and start reading it now. It's a long read, but it's well worth your time. But it's also not read enough. So we'll start that, Lord willing, in 3 weeks. So just be aware of that. With that said, let's get into the introduction, and then I'll make some comments, and we'll read the text.
Friendship with David and Jonathan is well documented in the Scripture. According to 1 Samuel 10, the soul of Jonathan is knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as he joined Saul. On the evening, David was forced to flee from King Saul. Two men parted company in an emotional scene. After kissing one another, they wept together, but David more so. Jonathan then said to David, "Go in peace, since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, May the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went to the sea. Despite being in line to inherit the throne after Saul's death, Jonathan realized he would not be Israel's next king. On their final meeting, Jonathan found David in the wilderness and made this known. He stated, "Do not fear, for the land of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that." So the two of them made a covenant between them, and David stayed in the woods, and Jonathan went to his own house. The covenant that existed between the men was likely the same agreement they swore to uphold in 1 Samuel 20:22. The terms of this covenant were set forth by Jonathan before David left the house of Saul. He said, "And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. Now, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." Our lesson text describes David's efforts to keep the covenant he made with Jonathan, something he also told Saul he would do. As the passage begins, David asked, "Is there still anyone who is left in the house of Saul that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" When he learns of one of Jonathan's sons is still living, David makes provisions for his king. Speaking to the son, whose name was
Mephibosheth.
David declared, "Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore you to all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually." This was only the beginning of David's generosity. He made a promise to his friend Jonathan, and he intended to keep it.
Okay, so as the lesson's already said, it's just going to cover 3 different ideas. One, remembering and honoring Jonathan by honoring his son. Also, the connection between David and Mephibosheth, and even what happens afterwards in the life of Mephibosheth. So we'll read the text, the first couple of verses here in chapter 9. Then we actually will dive a little bit deeper into each of the subsections here. It would say, "Now David said, Is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him to David, the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, At your service. Then the king said, Is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. And so the king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel in Lo-debar. And the king David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-debar.
questions about Saul's sins were answered. Is it for the former servant of Saul's house? He responded, there is still a son of Jonathan who was slain in his king. The circumstance under which Jonathan's son became slain while describing the sentence in the fourth. For his name was Mephibosheth, but he should not be confused with another Saul, son of Saul's, who had the same name. After inquiring of his whereabouts, King David sent and brought him out of the house of the son of David of Mephibosheth, the son by the king, and felt about this is not stated in the text. Surely he considered the possibility of the new king will eliminate all of the sins that was formed around him. Regardless, he presented himself for King David.
Okay, just kind of going off that last text right there. When you look later in the text, it will give us the response of Mephibosheth, and it's pretty straightforward. One of the things that's interesting about vows in the early centuries compared to now is, you know how people said this country was built, there used to be value in the word of a man, but now a lot of people, they just say things and they don't even commit to what they promised they would do. Jesus would say something about that in Matthew chapter 5. Verse 33, he would say, again, you've heard that it was said in those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. So you can lie to people, but don't lie to God. That's a problem. But I say to you, don't swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair black or white. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For what is more than these is from the evil one. It's almost like, well, yeah, let's make a promise, but there's conditions, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But if we're going to promise people we're going to do things, we need to uphold those promises. If you were to try to do that back in this day and you didn't uphold your promise, it showed how low of an individual you were, how little you actually respected other people for your promises. And just people had a bad view of you. David didn't want that. And do you think maybe if David didn't do anything with Saul's descendants, that anybody would have known anything about the promise him and Jonathan made? No, you look at the last text, the only person, well, Saul's gone, the only person who may have known something may have been there was that little boy who went to go fetch the arrow and then he went away back into the city. That's about it. But no, he probably could have gotten away with it, but not in God's eyes. And let's think selfish for a moment. You have a son of a former king, or at least a grandson of the former king, and he's the last one left of the prior lineage. What would a lot of people say you need to do about that problem? Yeah, make it in mud. Eliminate him. It's not uncommon to see that in early times, to see Rome's development. They would take out any kind of successor to the throne, especially in the Caesars, a very bloody family lineage. But that's the same thing here. And it's interesting, the text would actually say, where is it? Verse 3. The king said, is there not still someone in the house of Saul whom I may show the kindness of God? In that statement, this is what he's saying. People did me wrong in the past, but I want to do good for them in the future. They didn't even give me a chance, but I want to give them a chance. They didn't give me the time of the day and treated me low as dirt, and it wouldn't even be gratuitous for me. Wouldn't give me a home, wouldn't give me food. It's literally trying to seek the end of my life. I want to try to promote life, build you up, make you into someone. Totally different attitudes. And it's interesting thinking eternal plan-wise. At what point do we deserve anything that God has given us? Yeah. You look at Luke chapter 17, it gives us parable of the servant. And the servant who's working for the master, the attitude is, I'm still not profitable for my master. or I'm thankful he's allowed me to work. That's the kind of attitude we need to have. And I think that's one of the characters of God that David is showing here. Kindness in the midst of a bad past and still helping people. Now, I think it's interesting as well, even though it makes a brief mention of it. In 2 Samuel chapter 4, I do want to read this text. To kind of give us a little bit of a time frame. 2 Samuel 4, verse 4, it would say, Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet, but he wasn't born this way. It would say he was 5 years old when news came about Saul and Jonathan from Jezreel, and a nurse took him up and fled, and it happened. And as she made haste to flee, that he fell, he became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now that name means son of shame, but I think in reference to his family's history, that might be where that sense of shame comes from. That's where it may have nothing to do with the name. But that's interesting. When you look in the last chapter, we're looking at a young kid, a 5-year-old kid, who just lost his granddad, his dad. It doesn't even say anything about his mom. He was taken in the care of a caregiver. And it doesn't even mention the caregiver whenever Ziba comes and says, oh yeah, there's one more who's left. And if you notice in the text, it would say he was found in Lo-Debar. That's, David's in Jerusalem. Lo-Debar is a Hebrew term for Gilead. It's way up north. He's having to go over mountains in the far corner recesses of Israel to find the last heir of Saul. So he went the distance. And I'm pretty sure David paid for all the accommodations to make sure he got there. Yes?
Why would he be living there instead of on his grandfather Saul's property?
I have some thoughts. So in the text, we'll see that Mephibosheth ends up regaining that property. I think after Saul died and Jonathan died, there may have been some very greedy individuals who said, oh, he's gone, okay, let's take this.
It sounds like they were already taking care of it for Saul anyway. And then they it's still called Ziba, servant of Saul. Yes, so I mean, it looks like since Saul was gone, they just took it and they didn't give it to any of the offspring.
It could also be a protection tactic in case David didn't have a heart of kindness. If any lineage of Saul was left, traditionally they'd be slaughtered. And you see that in Kings and Chronicles a lot. But that's the only thing I can think of.
What about him being lame?
Well, he wouldn't be able to protect himself much. But even though it says lame, it does say that Mephibosheth presented himself before David. So he could walk. I think what it was, he broke a bone and it healed back in a weird way, and he always had like a permanent limp, is what it seems like.
Man, he's stretching himself.
Yeah.
Okay.
He probably had a good upper body.
I mean, maybe he was caretakers kind of took him in to help him.
Awesome.
Now, the term in verse 1 that is there any left in the house of Saul? Now, is that mean family of Saul, or does that mean within the confines of the area where Saul the kingdom was? Is the house referring to family? Is that referring to? And if so, and if not, are we to assume that this is the only family kinfolks they had, or this is the only one within the confines or house of the castle or whatever they lived in? You know what I'm saying? I mean, you think that a king would have more than one relative. Like I said, he kind of alluded to that.
There were more too, because later on there were 7 that were hung because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites, and that was through. In fact, one of those was named Mephibosheth.
Yeah, and more than likely he was named after that.
And that was through the daughters of them instead of through the son, Jonathan.
And I think that was way before Jonathan's death when that occurred.
I believe it was after. I think even after David left. Maybe I thought it was after he left Jerusalem and after that. But
maybe not, it was the Gibeonites that hung him because they wanted advantage.
You know, if we were kin to Saul, and a new king came in, I'd be going somewhere else. I wouldn't be hanging around close, I'd be going to a different country. Knowing that you know, they would be put to death more likely.
That idea, when you go from chapter 2 to chapter 6, it's almost like the kingdom's in turmoil and they're trying to figure out who's going to sit on the throne. So there's a lot of assassinations in this text. And I believe Mephibosheth, he would have been the last legitimate one. And it calls him Saul's son. I think that was legitimately his last son. After that, there was no son of Saul to ascend to the throne. And I don't think they would have let a grandchild go to the throne either. But then it doesn't say that there's anybody else who comes to David other than, well, no, it says in verse 1, left at the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. I don't know if that's in reference specifically only to Jonathan, or if he's saying because of the vow that I made for your family. It even makes mention of another vow that he made whenever he spared Saul the second time. Saul said, promise me you will care for my household. And this is the only name that pops up. So more than likely, they almost got wiped out. Interesting enough, what tribe was Saul from? You remember the terrible incident in the last half of Judges that involved the Benjamites? And it wiped out almost the entire tribe, and people were like, well, why did you let this happen, Lord? Well, y'all ignored the law, and you went ahead and slaughtered all the tribe except for the women, and now they're complaining they don't have husbands. You caused this. I think that same thing was about to happen, but that's just an interesting side note.
It still happens today in some of the Far East countries.
It does. And there's still that turmoil. But I think that goes back to, was it the saying that Jacob and Esau, their descendants, will always have issues? Should that be considered ongoing prophecy? Okay.
What Samuel was talking about in the 7th sentence is in chapter 41. The verse,
it had two sons that were born to Saul, but through I guess it'd be grandson.
Well, never mind. Then that is verse 1. That is specifically for Jonathan's lineage, not anybody else's.
There were two sons one was also called Mephibosheth, the other Armani, or his Armani. And then 5 sons of his daughter, Saul's daughter.
Yeah, and later in the text, that's where they end up recovering Jonathan and Saul and his brother, their bones, and brings it back to Benjamin.
so is that the same Michael and David?
Michael didn't have it.
She did.
She didn't have it.
Yeah, she had that. Yeah.
You know, well, Ziba seemed to take advantage of Mephibosheth, really. And we read later when David had to leave Jerusalem, Mephibosheth sent him some presents and then said, Mephibosheth said he'd stay there because he's going to become king. And which sounds like a lie, really. To try to.
See, well, I read through that text a couple of times, and at first, I wasn't trying to read it in view of what motives might be. I was just trying to read the text. At first, it didn't seem like trickery. It just seemed like he was really good at what he was assigned to do. But it may have been pride that crept up in the latter half, saying, look at what I've accomplished. I should be king for this. But I don't know if David's, well...
Logically look at it. Who was already there that said they were king? And how's this lame guy gonna take on Saul's son? I mean, David's son, and how's he gonna take on David? There's no way that he could become king.
Unless he went to a different country and became king. That didn't work out.
And that is even logically makes sense what this Ziba told David.
We'll actually get to that here a little later on, because that's an interesting account. We'll save that. Any other comments? Okay, quite a few. Okay, so Mephibosheth and David. So now Mephibosheth has been summoned before David. Now we're going to see a little bit of conversation that takes place between them. Beginning in verse 6. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself, he bowed down. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Here is your servant. And he said to him, Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. And then he bowed himself and said, What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I?
When Mephibosheth appeared before the king, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. When addressed, he identified himself as David's servant. David responded, I do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Regarding David's statement, Smith observed, David sensed the man was afraid. Mephibosheth would not have remembered that affection between David and his father. David assured the man he had nothing to fear. He intended to show kindness to him for the sake of his father, Jonathan, for whom David had a close relationship. After calling Mephibosheth, David promised to both provide for him and honor him. He provided for Mephibosheth by giving him the land formerly owned by Saul. He honored Mephibosheth by reserving a place for him at the king's table. David had been allowed to sit at Saul's table, and Mephibosheth would be allowed to sit at his own. The Noah wrote, Sitting together at the table carries strong connotations of friendship and fellowship between the participants at the meal. Shared meals were a common means of covenant ratification and of the expression of covenant solidarity. David's kindness toward Mephibosheth may anticipate something of the invitation of David's greater son to his followers to sit at his table. They were considered members of his own household. On hearing David's generous offer, Mephibosheth bowed himself and said, What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? And though he was the grandson of a king, Mephibosheth did not act with the sense of entitlement. For his part, David more than keeps his commitment to Jonathan. Summarizing this encounter, David wrote, David goes far beyond any bare requirement. David doesn't merely spare Mephibosheth's life, but keeps goodness on him. He not only protects his life, but restores his inheritance. He not only saves him from the shadow of death, but prepares a table for him. David's kindness goes beyond survival to sustenance. Mephibosheth is cared for by and with the king, and will never face destitution. It takes no imagination, but only faith to see that David's hesed is but a faithful reflection of Yahweh's, with one whom there is no such thing as bare hesed.
Okay, so a verse kind of comes to mind with this concept, who is man that you're so mindful of him? Again, going back to the reflection of why God cares so much about him. I think it goes back to the idea of looking deeper into the phrase of the kindness of God. I think of Luke chapter 10 with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Helping other people doesn't necessarily mean, well, I made a promise to your great-great-great-great-grandfather, and I promised to uphold it. Well, I made a promise to my God, and I promise to honor all men, especially those who are in need and those who are suffering. I think our commitment to God ends up giving us a greater responsibility. Not necessarily that we should take care of everyone. There is that sense where we need to have genuine concern for everyone. But I think it's just a matter of seeing the opportunity, working with that opportunity, making the most of that opportunity, the best that we can. That's kind of one of the things we're going to talk about this evening, where we're talking about helping parents or honoring parents later in life. How do we honor older people in society. But there's kind of I don't want to say it's a two-way street that determines whether or not we act on that. But sometimes in seeing people less fortunate, you look at James 1, pure religion is this, pure and undefiled. What is it? Visiting orphans, taking care of the widow. And the idea there is not, well, Jimmy's in an orphan home, I need to take care of him, he doesn't have parents. This is someone who can't take care of themselves, and this is someone who is alone, and they need help. And in this sense, we're seeing, instead of throwing judgment down here, as mentioned in the last section, David is taking that kind of appreciation and concern for Mephibosheth. And really, let's think about that statement. In today's time, we think of a cute little puppy in verse 8. Dogs in ancient times, what do we know about them? I'm talking about literal dogs, not like downright scoundrels. You know how people view coons today? Rats. Not in high regard. That's about how they view dogs. They're just animals. That's it. Pixar didn't exist at that time, so we're not thinking, oh, they have an imagination and things like that. Granted, even though in the proverb writer would say a man of wisdom cares for his animals, there is wisdom in that. It's not saying there were no dogs taken care of, but they were seen as like the lowest of low. An image that pops to mind immediately, when Jezebel was thrown out of the tower, who was it that took out the most wicked woman in the world? Don't say the ground, but yeah, dogs. Dogs took her out. So even on the animal scale, the lowest viewed animal took out the most wicked person to ever live, according to Scripture. So I think Mephibosheth equating himself to this, saying, look, I'm lame, I'm worthless, my family history is bad, I don't see this working out for me. You ever doubt yourself and your abilities towards God? Ever doubt your abilities toward your spouse, or your friends, or your children, or even to your parents, your grandparents? We have some issues at times. But humility can pay off when used correctly. I'm not saying use it as, oh, if he gave me all these things. But we shouldn't be so humble and haughty to say, well, I deserve this. That's my heritage. No, it's not. Even if you rightfully deserve something, let other people give it to you. God's going to exalt those who humble themselves under his arm. You see that in 1 Peter 5. And with Mephibosheth right here, what about the servant who really can't do anything? And he is powerless, especially before the king. Who am I that I can come before you? And it's the opposite mentality of Naaman from 2 Kings 5. Behold, I thought, who am I? I'm a captain. I've helped lead through all these battles, and we've been successful. Who cares? In the view of God, humble yourself. In the view of kings as well, Proverbs has a few things to say about that. But I think it's interesting just the approach that he takes. Not haughty, not arrogant, not prideful, and I guess later on what we see from Ziba, trying to take advantage of that. We need to be very careful about that. Any comments or thoughts? Verses 9 through 13. The king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to you your master's son, all that belonged to Saul, and all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him. You will bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Ziba said to the king, according to all my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a younger son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet.
David understood that Mephibosheth was not physically able to oversee the properties he was restoring to him. Consequently, he charged Ziba with the task of managing the land. He said, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. As Baldwin noted, David's suggestion that Ziba work the land of Mephibosheth may have food to eat was an understatement. He will have independent needs. Ziba responded to David's direction by affirming his intention to be obedient. Whether he agreed to work the land because he had no other choice is debatable. What is not unclear, however, is that Ziba later took advantage of the situation to gain David's favor. Nevertheless, David placed Ziba under Mephibosheth's authority. The account ends by re-emphasizing the wonderful result of David's gracious comment to Jonathan. Arnold summed up the scene well. King David keeps moving from glory to glory. At this point in our story, he has fulfilled every promise and been granted every blessing. It is through David that Yahweh is making Israel the nation they have hoped to be all along, and the nation that Yahweh can use in turn to bless the world. Thus, this passage contributes to the theme. What sort of man may serve suitably as a king of Israel? Mephibosheth may not serve as king, for he is a continuation of Saul's line. But David is ideal as king. His faithfulness to Jonathan moves him to be generous to Mephibosheth. His magnanimity goes far beyond any political benefits he may have received from having Mephibosheth in his court. He is lavish in his love for Jonathan, making his generosity appropriate. This is the character Israel wants and needs as its king.
Okay, two texts to take into consideration with this. Ziba in chapter 16, this is the one that I read. That's why I said it's questionable. 19 is a lot more pretty straightforward. But Ziba's really good at his craft. David would say, look, I'm going to make you a ruler over the land. But chapter 19 is the one I want to look at. This will be quite a few years down the road. Ziba is going to deceive Mephibosheth in not relaying certain information, and we'll find that in this text. It would say Mephibosheth, this verse 24 of 19. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, for he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until he returned in peace. So this is actually quite a few months. So it was when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go to the king, because your servant is lame. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Therefore do what is good in your eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before the Lord king, yet you set your servant among those who eat at your own table. Therefore what right have I still to cry out any more the king? So the king said to him, why do you speak any more of your matters? I have said, you and Ziba divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, rather let him take it all, insomuch as my lord the king has come back in peace on his own house. Now, there's a couple of questions that come up from that text. Here's Ziba, even though he didn't relay information, saying to Mephibosheth, you need to come see David. David still equates it, verse 29 and 30, as if they both have equal right to the territory that's in question. And even in verse 30, Mephibosheth says, let him have it. There's no point of me having something I can't take care of. What are your thoughts on that?
Did Ziba lie before this in chapter 16?
Oh, which statement?
When he said, let's see, from verse 2, actually 1, 2, and 3 and 4. When David was leaving Jerusalem, and when he got run out, and he was talking to Ziba, which brought him some gifts. In verse 3 says, "Where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he's staying in Jerusalem, for he said, Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me."
No, that would be a lie.
Which doesn't make sense, again, because Ziba's lame and has no power, really. And here Absalom is overtaking the kingdom, which he has all the power, and David, of course, so, And so at that point, David says, "Well, the land's yours."
So
It's like some trickery and lies to me.
It almost seems like a Haman type thing, trying to use deception to get power. I don't know, Mephibosheth gives up the land, gives it to Ziba, even though his intentions are wicked. You think this could be a 1 Peter 2 thing, whenever people use you, despise you, pretty much abuse what you have or who you are for their gains? I think this could be an example of that.
Ziba knows he's in a better place with David than he is on that land. He can't take care of it himself. Maybe that's not a good, safe place for him anyway. Somebody does that. With 15 sons.
20 servants. Well, that's when he started. Who knows how many he had by this point? Well, I'll just have to look into that more, because I know it mentions Ziba a few more times, but I don't know if it mentions anything of Mephibosheth's death. It did say Mephibosheth had a son, so I don't know if it makes any mention of his son after all this as well. I don't know.
There's several instances in our Testament where we're saying now about older generations leaving things to the younger generation and inheritance. And when you get in the New Testament, it's more the example we have is to sell everything you own and give it to the poor. Which way are we supposed to go?
Okay, so you're dealing with two different principles. That's one of the verses I ended up cutting from Proverbs for this evening's lessons. A father's glory is to leave an inheritance for his children's children. I think that's a financial thing, or at least planning for or helping children for their future. Now that's within their means to set that aside, and they had every right to do that. It's like Aquila and Priscilla. While the money was your own, could you not do with it as you pleased? And in a sense, financially speaking, that's a really wise idea. Well, okay. From the perspective, if I were receiving it, yeah, more power to me. But thinking ahead, if you have so much stuff, why would you? Well, God shows favor in that. Now, in the sense that, what if you have even more? If you don't want to plan on giving it to them, what should you do with it? Well, the principle of material possessions is simply don't lust after them. If you want to give them to the poor, give them to the poor. There's honor in that. If you want to save it and give it to your children or your grandchildren, you have every right to do that. But also take into consideration as well, are you trying to just throw everything to them because you don't feel like dealing with all the extra amount of stuff or whatnot? I think just using wise judgment is really going to determine how you use that. So both are right. You just have to figure out what's the best way to allocate in both of those situations. But that is a confusing thought. It's a good thought, though.
Some people value some of the children and some of the church.
That's true.
So, I mean, they divided the inheritance what the ways do their thing. I know that in the old building, we had a brother that passed away, left quite a bit of money to the congregation. And it was through that contribution we were able to build this parlor this building.
You know, when Jesus did say to the one young man to sell what he had, give it for you, all he had, and Jesus knew what was number one in that man's life that he was dealing with. I don't know of any other place where it says sell everything you have. You're supposed to sell everything you have and give to the Lord. But we do read about when people sell things that they had and they did give to the poor. So I mean, I think again, it's if something was, I guess, more important, anything is more important than God, we need to try to give it up.
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to. And I don't think there's a rule that says everything we need to do is sell everything we have to give. But it's, again, we need to know what's number one and support that.
That was actually from the family questionnaires that we got back so far. That was not actually one of the ideas presented, but I think I will end up doing a lesson on leaving inheritance. Just from the standpoint of how do we work through the difficulties of they sold everything, but what if they have a family? Am I not provide for my family? What if they're left out destitute of their basic needs? That makes me worse than an infidel. That's kind of a complex issue, so I think I'll do a lesson on that. I need to know that too, so I know how to trick my parents. But that's all the time that we have for this. Any closing comments or last statements? Okay, we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you for your time and attention, and we'll be back.